Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Sunday Shot on this fine Sunday morning. Yes, it's true. The rumours are correct. Dave Milner is back on Australian soil, but not joining us here just at the moment. On there he is. Dave, we thought we were going to have another internet glitch like we did when you were in Spain, but here you are, not quite in the flesh, but happening.
Oh,
Welcome.
thank you. Thank you. Lovely to be here, Joe.
Good
Who
to have
else
you
we
back.
got? Yeah.
Um, We are delighted as well to be joined this morning by living legend Marie Coleman, Twitter star. There she is. Welcome, Marie. Thank you for joining the Sunday Shot.
Nice to meet you again.
And Royce Kurmelovs, who's coming in from Byron Bay, where he has sighted people wearing jackets for the first time since he's been there for 2 years. Welcome, Royce. Good to have you on the Sunday Shot.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, look, there's a lot going on at the moment internationally. As we speak, there are boots on the ground in DC parading in honor of dear leader Trump. His birthday, also, it has to be said, the 250th anniversary of the American military, and haven't they done a lot in their years? There has also been some tragic news coming out of Minnesota where targeted assassinations of local Democrat representatives. It's taken place overnight with a very sophisticated operation from an assassin masquerading as a police officer. We've got the G7 coming up, and hooray, it's finally been confirmed that Albanese will get his sidebar meeting with Trump. Um, and then, of course, we've got the conflagration in the Middle East taking a new and more sinister turn for the Iranians, with Israel launching unilateral strikes there. So there's a lot going on, as well as it seems like an eon ago, but Albanese faced the press club and set out his second term agenda. So we're going to try and cover all of these things before we get to our interview with Kevin Bonham about what the hell's going on in Tasmania. But let's just start with that terrible news overnight, Royce, about the assassinations of two state based Democrat representatives in Minnesota. Uh, the ex Speaker of the House was shot fatally alongside her husband in her home. And then the assassin moved on to another Democrat politician who was shot with his wife in their home. And it looks like that they will survive. What do we know thus far?
Well, it's. We should also be very clear that this is still very early in the process, so we
Yep.
don't know much. What we know, based on I believe the police released the name, who I'm presently forgetting, which is
Vance Bolter,
Vance Belter.
Boelt. Yeah.
Yes, which is an incredible name to begin with. But what we know so far, based on people running down his background on using social media and going back through his previous works, is that this person appears to come from the kind of right wing Christian background and has been motivated by anti abortion sentiment. Wired, for instance, recently published that they reviewed a video of this person giving a
A
speech.
sermon.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
sermon. That's right, a sermon
Yeah.
to a congregation in Congo where he was railing against people who support abortion and basically flagging that I think the words used were, God was going to raise up apostles to go and correct what he saw was an immorality. And I think that's what's happened here. And what we also know, based on police statements, is that the alleged suspect in the shooting had a list of 70 names. So that wasn't just two people that they were planning to kill, but there were dozens essentially if they were able to do so without,
Mm.
without being stopped.
And it was a very sort of sophisticated operation in the sense that he was masquerading a police officer and had like an SUV with lights. He had the police vest. He had a taser. For all intents and purposes, when these poor politicians opened the doors, they would have fully believed that he was indeed the officer that he was pretending to be.
Absolutely, and it raises the critical question: well, how? How
Yeah.
did he get a hold of these
Mm.
materials? How this was clearly something that was planned and planned with a significant length of time. What did he say what did he say to these people before they opened the door to get them to open the door? And then how did he put this together? But that is something that will obviously come as
Mm.
investigations unfold.
It's interesting if he's wearing official police gear and he has official identification, he's actually displaying more than ICE agents are at the moment. They're hiding their faces, they're not identifying themselves. I guess this is just, I was a bit shocked about this news because my head is full of all the state violence that's happening at the moment
Yeah.
in America. It's just a reminder that individuals are also a little bit unsettled at the moment too.
Well, the interesting thing before we get on to ICE itself is that there have now been a number of reports of people masquerading as ICE agents in order just to commit normal acts of violence, as it were. I mean, America is in a very dark place at the moment. And in fact, we're into No King's Day, which is the mass protests against the Trump administration, and in particular, some of this overreach of his state authority. Some of those protests, particularly in Minnesota, have been cancelled out of respect to the with the killed and injured politicians, but they are continuing around the rest of the country. And it looks at the moment as there are many more uh, people protesting than there are attending this rather anomalous military parade taking place in the US in front of Trump. Uh, we're going to get a bit more into Trump a bit later, but this week, even though it feels like a long time ago, we did actually see Albanese address the National Press Club and set out what he says will be his agenda for the next 3 years, which included talk about the public service refresh, a lot of chat about productivity, and then this term progressive patriotism. Marie, if we start perhaps with the new appointments that he's made to the public service, these seem to have been very well received in terms of Stephen Kennedy stepping up to the head of Prime Minister and Cabinet. We've got our first Secretary of the Treasury, female Secretary of the Treasury as well. Very much putting to bed the criticisms and the derogatory kind of take of the public service that we had seen throughout the election campaign from the coalition, and restoring them as the true partners in government that they should be.
Yeah, well, that's very much been the Labor position since the change. I mean, it was their position before the change of government, and it's been their position since. But yes, both Kennedy and Jenny Wilkinson are very highly regarded. And the only actual dealings I've had with Jenny Wilkinson was when she was in the Parliamentary Budget Office. But they're very good people. They're very competent people, and that will produce a strong sense of confidence, I think, in the rest of the public service, that it's people that they know who've had long experience and who are respected. And that matters a great deal at this stage, because there's still a lot of change to go on in the public service.
There was also this talk of a progressive patriotism for our
Yes.
country. Now, it's hard to know quite what is meant by that. It's obviously reclamation of patriotism from the right, and that sort of allegiance to a more populist nationalism. But I mean, Mark Kenny posed the question, is it just next level political spin? Or is there some kind of next level national purpose aimed at genuine social, cultural, and civic self awareness? Dave, I think you have.
I think it sounds like such a bullshit Orwellian phrase, to be honest. But I think talking about it with any sort of seriousness treats it with more respect than it deserves. Because if we're being patriotic, we're not. How are we doing that if we're just serving ourselves as a vassal state for a declining empire that's descending into fascism and constant genocide? That's not patriotism. That's bullshit. And it's governing for the easily distracted and the easily appeased. In my personal opinion, I'm sure other people might have a different vibe.
But there is that sense that trying to assert, and that was very much the tenor of Albanese's speech, that we do things the Australian way, we do things differently here. He made much of him being a Labor Prime Minister, and therefore is his support of workers and real wage rises and so on. But that Australia, the best place in the world to live, is approaching politics, culture, and society differently, even as we are integrating our military and our geopolitical strategy much more with the US than we have in the past. And despite the US itself now announcing a review of AUKUS. Marie, what do you make of this progressive patriotism coupled with this sort of military integration with the US?
Well, we managed to be fairly progressive in our patriotism, that is to say, nobody talked about it, until we had Mr. Howard going absolutely overboard with the extraordinary build-up of the Anzac celebrations and so forth. I mean, you didn't talk about it. It just wasn't done. It was seen as rather vulgar, in fact, to be carrying on about being patriotic. I think of all the years that, I mean, certainly during the war, we had to be very patriotic. I'm so old, I'm referring to World War II, of course. But, since then, people took no notice of Australia Day. It was just another day, and yes, it was all very good. We seem to go into this excessive spin with the Howard government. And I don't know just what Mr. Albanese is trying to get at, but if he's basically saying we don't need to keep on wrapping ourselves in the flag to be patriotic Australians, well, that's a welcome return to what Australia used to be like about 20 odd years ago.
I'm not sure that's what he's saying, though. I would like him to be saying that, and I agree with every observation you've made, Marie. Even in my 40 years, I've observed the rah-rah flag waving become much more of a thing. I don't see that he's saying that in terms of what he's outlining as policy, and he's off to Washington to continue along this tragic path. So it feels like rhetoric more than anything else to me. It feels like something to distract a very simple, very captured press pack.
I think. Sorry, go.
No, you go.
No, I think we actually need to take a step back to understand what was going on with this speech. I think the progressive patriotism thing is a very convenient branding, and one that borrows from, say, what's happening in Canada with the reaction to Trump, and particularly Trump's threats to invade. I think that when you look at the speech and understand what was going on there, this was a prime minister who is attempting to cast the narrative for his government over the next 4 terms. That should be obvious. But specifically, I think the prime minister was attempting to salvage and restate his theory of government and theory of change. I mean, this is a approach that relies upon process, civility, discussion, consultation, that really emphasizes process to achieve something, which, even if it's a small game, the idea being that you can build on over time. Now, that theory, that approach to governing, took a battering with the voice referendum when it failed pretty significantly and almost catastrophically for him at the time. And I think what's happened now is that this was Albanese trying to restate this as an effort to, now that his opposition has been cleared effectively with the last election, and to get back to what he thinks how things should go, even though we've known that's taken a serious blow in terms of how reactive it is to events.
Yeah, I think one of the things that he said was trying to debunk the corrosive proposition that politics and government and democratic institutions, including a free media, are incapable of meeting the demands of this moment. And he was saying some dismiss this sentiment and others cynically seek to harvest it. And whether that was an oblique reference to the US, even as he's cozying up to them, he said our responsibility is to disprove it. So I think you're right, Royce. There is sort of stating his idea of government, although it's interesting you mention the failed voice referendum, because at the heart of our democratic experiment is, of course, still the gaping wound with the failure of Australia being able to reconcile with its First Nations peoples. And that was not mentioned at all in his address, apart from in response to a question from Sarah Henderson from SBS at the end about the deaths in custody. So it is an interesting take, but it is one with gaps and flaws, one would have to argue.
It strikes me that there are echoes of his Whitlam Foundation address in the last term, where again he was sort of slow and steady and coordinated management. You couldn't just deal with one crisis, you had to be able to deal with a whole lot of things bubbling along at once, which is very much his style of government. You know, cautious, steady, coordinated, nothing flashy seemed to me to be what he was basically saying. And I presume that's basically what he's restating.
And I think also and you make a very good point, Joe, in terms of the questions that were asked. I mean, we had brief mentions of some of the biggest issues, but as much as this was about stating not only the problem but and reinforcing his idea of government, a lot of the big questions just went unaddressed. There was mention made of climate change, for instance, but the prime minister was not asked about that over the course of the address. Gaza didn't get a mention. What's happening in the US didn't get much hearing. So we had a kind of search for ideas and a statement of the problem, and at least I would suggest actually a recognition that there is an issue there. It's just an open question about whether this sort of managerial style is enough to meet the moment.
It feels very much like a continuation of the small target that he ran on in opposition. Small target, small man for a big moment.
Well, I think the kind of slow and steady wins the race approach is left wanting when there are basic crises erupting everywhere. And we do seem to be in a constant state of crisis at a global level at the moment. Um, there continues to be this sort of magical thinking assertion that everything is fine with AUKUS and everything is fine with our bedrock ally, the US, even as America is erupting. And we are seeing now Trump and Hesketh and their cronies sicking the military onto their own people in Los Angeles. So if we look at AUKUS first, I mean, Richard Marles this week, when the US announced that they were going to have a review of AUKUS, because there does seem to be a different approach emerging with the Virginia-class submarines from this administration, that they may be redeployed, they may be retrofitted for domestic American use, which would mean there aren't going to be any spares to send our way, despite the $800 million down payment that we've made on them. Despite the US review, Richard Marles is saying, this is fine. This is what would naturally happen with an incoming administration, which rather begs the question, why did not such a review happen when the Albanese government was incoming? But it does seem to be, Marie, a bit of magical thinking going on, which does not serve us or our national interests.
Yes, I was just noticing that the independents in the federal parliament have, I think, put forward a motion to have an independent inquiry into AUKUS. It would be interesting to see what happens out of that request. There are a lot of interesting Australian voices, particularly around Hugh White, raising questions about AUKUS, about whether we need a different posture. I'm not a defence expert, so I'm not capable of really looking at this. But we've got so many American bases here. The Americans don't have to give us those superannuated submarines. They're just operating them out of HMAS Sterling. We are already a US base in this area of the world, and that's, as White points out in his essay, this is precisely the spot where they can interrupt Chinese supply lines and cause a whole lot of difficulty. That doesn't necessarily have to be all in the immediate vicinity of China. It's going through the Malacca Straits and places like that. But the Americans have that happening without Australia ever owning the submarines. Although I suppose we'd be handy to look after them when they come to shore.
And they've also, they've launched bombing runs to the Middle East from Australian soil, which makes us a legitimate military target, if anything does. I think we should talk about Richard Marles just a little bit, because I had a few moments being back in Australia and driving around listening to ABC radio and just wanting to exclaim, because it's just up is down, left is right at the moment. But Richard Marles was interviewed and they asked him why there wasn't some sort of plan B. And he sort of implied inherently that having a plan B was the problem initially. That's how we went wrong with the French thing, and that we have to be all in on this, which seems like Manchurian candidate shit to say to you. It's just utterly irresponsible. And I don't know why the ABC wasn't instantly, that's irresponsible.
Well,
Right.
but there's a fascinating bit of context to this, that when Australia first acquired its submarines from the British, Britain sold Australia its most outdated, worthless World War II relics it could, and then Australia had to basically pay double to fix them up. So you're paying twice the cost of the submarine to make them work. And there is a degree to which history appears to be repeating here. And so, we talk about the idea that, the current public line is that, oh, the review is a natural part of this process. But given the volatility of Trump, people in government have to be kind of panicking about whether they put all their eggs in one basket at this point. But I think the implication of the review is, if this comes back and says AUKUS is not worthwhile to an American first agenda, that's an issue. But it's also an issue if it comes back and the US government says, actually, this is great. Australia keeps handing us money. We don't have to do anything in return. We've got a problem.
Yeah. Keating's take, reliably florid, was maybe America can save us from ourselves and from a deal hurriedly scribbled on the back of an envelope by Scott Morrison, along with the vacuous British blowhard Boris Johnson and the confused President Joe Biden, put together on an English beach a world away from where Australia's strategic interests primarily lie. I mean, that seems to me to be pretty spot on. And you do now have a whole queue of Australian ex-prime ministers, such as Malcolm Turnbull as well, lining up to criticise this deal on the basis of the deal itself. So Turnbull's very much, this is a bad deal. We're paying money for nothing. Keating is very much like, this is such a retrograde step for the geopolitical strategy which we had been developing that positioned us very much here in the Asian region. Marie, you would have been in Canberra at the time that Paul Keating and Bob Hawke were essentially the architects of this our region first policy that was just seemingly thrown out on a whim of Scott Morrison and then endorsed inexplicably by Albanese.
Well, yes. I mean, Scott Morrison particularly was embedding us with the Americans. He managed to infuriate the Chinese so much that it actually infuriated a lot of our primary producers eventually because of the implications for us. But and I'm pleased to see that even though he doesn't have one of the good parliamentary pensions, he's got himself a job in the US defence sector, which is jolly handy.
Along with so many other politicians, Joe Hockey, Christopher Pyne, yourself, Gibbons, Arthur Sinodinos. Sorry, go on.
Yes, well, we're just so embedded with the Americans that even though people who are really informed, like Hugh Whitehead, let alone Keating and others, are saying we've got to retrieve it, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to retrieve it, with given the extent to which our defence establishment is so thoroughly locked in. It is just going to be a very complicated process, both physically and politically, I think, to disengage.
I think that's undoubtable, but again, I don't think that's not a good enough reason not to start along the process, given the ramifications and the consequences.
Absolutely.
I personally prefer to disentangle ourselves from war crimes and genocide in the Middle East.
Yeah,
we don't have. That's optional. We don't have to do that.
Yeah.
But I mean, there does seem to be no movement whatsoever to start that process. We are still.
Oh yeah, no, you get fired for saying that.
All the way with the USA. Before we move on to the US and the upcoming G7 and the way that is now being sort of massively distracted from by Israel yet again, Just a quick take on the other big news that came out of Albanese's speech. Jim Chalmers had already been talking about the focus on productivity in this term, and I think we're going to hear more about that during Chalmers' address next week, but to the press club next week. But there is this sort of idea that that is now inflation has been more or less dampened, and so now we're going to be looking at how does Australia become more productive. And Royce, there's a whole suite of reports that are going to be coming down from the Productivity Commission throughout July. They're going to be, it's going to be like, when does the next episode drop? We're going to have one report dropping each week for 5 weeks, and really dealing with an array of topics, everything from corporate taxes, the broader regulatory framework, AI, care economy, um, each, I mean, is this, do you think, going to be setting up the government to be able to be more ambitious by dealing with, grappling with the contents of this report, these reports? For
Me?
you, Royce, or
Yeah.
just more broadly on the way that productivity seems to be moving to the centre of the Albanese's government's agenda?
I think potentially maybe. I think the
Yep.
key with I think the key approach to this. I think my approach to understanding what has been taking place within the Albanese government over the course of its term is to see what actually happens. I think, and just to go back to the press council speech, I think if we're thinking about the ideas that are currently in play, we had a mention of like the abundance agenda and Andrew Leigh giving a speech to the Australian Financial Review recently.
The
I think
abundance
that
agenda is just everywhere, isn't it, at the
it is.
moment? It's like
It's
ubiquitous.
it's ubiquitous. It's a pop. For those who don't know, it's a pop politics book that was produced by two economists in the US, and there's been a number of criticisms of this. On the one hand, there is an argument to be made that there is nothing terribly offensive in this book. Throughout the way, there's a lot of discrete policy proposals, but most critics kind of land on 2 points: that this was a book written for a world in which Kamala Harris was president, and second of all, there is a feeling that this lacks an understanding of power, and particularly the power of business, the power of venture capital, and the power of organized money, essentially.
So
And
one thing it is doing is it's talking about a progressive supply side agenda. So it's essentially saying that the Liberals, for all the right reasons, they have introduced and implemented a whole lot of regulation for good things like environmental implications and but it has gummed up the system to the extent that government isn't able to do things anymore.
and this is where the critique comes in, that this feels to many people as if it's a Trojan horse for kind of old school third way, kind of Tony Blair style deregulatory politics. And it can be, and even if there are good proposals in there, it could be easily misused by people who are not acting in good faith. And this is where you get kind of, I suspect, a lot of the productivity ideas coming from, because part of the idea is we need to rip up red tape. And that sounds, on the face of it, the argument is, well, we need to deal with climate change, we need to rapidly build solar farms and wind turbines. But that also sounds great to people like Gina Reinhardt, who have been arguing for this for decades. And so we see this kind of, and I'm interested to see, as this productivity agenda rolls out, where they're actually going with this, what they're saying about AI, what ideas they're accepting about AI, what they're accepting about environmental regulation particularly. And we have a working example of what happens when you tear up these regulations. The Trump administration, the US Supreme Court, have just systematically torn up environmental regulations in the US and neutered the EPA, and particularly their capacity to deal with climate change. We have a scenario in Australia where Albanese himself intervened to stop the creation of an Environmental Protection Agency to shore up the Western Australian vote. So it almost seems as if these are already at play, and I'll be curious to see where they take it from here.
Yeah, I mean, the book uses the development of the COVID vaccine as an example of what good can come of ignoring process and just getting on with things. And Andrew Leigh picks up on that point and echoes some of the main themes of that book, as you say, he said, you can't meet a 2050 net zero emissions target if it takes 20 years to build a renewable energy project. So, yeah, it certainly, the book is occupying the zeitgeist and a lot of policymakers' heads in Australia, in the US, in the UK. So it'll be interesting to see. And I think you're right. We'll need to wait for the reports to drop and then to see which of the ideas in the reports. I mean, it's Danielle Wood has been leading this from the Productivity Commission, so they could well be, really interesting and dynamic kind of ideas, but which then get picked up and run with. Well, that's always the question. Now, the other big news of this week, which I think is now going to be dominating the G7, is, of course, Israel's move against Iran. It's probably useful to say, somewhat cynically, that it comes at a time when Netanyahu is under extreme pressure in Israel. He's facing the loss of his coalition in the Knesset, potential walkout by the two ultra-Orthodox parties around the issue of exemption for Orthodox young men studying. If they exemptions from military service for them. So literally a vote of no confidence is being called this week in his government at the same time as he is back in court for his corruption charges, featuring cameos from our very own James Packer. So the politics domestically for him are very, very difficult at the moment, which is not to say that's the only reason why he might have launched an attack on Iran at this moment. Iran has been facing some difficulties of its own with the weakening of their allies, Hezbollah, the falling of the Assad regime, some supply chain issues now coming into Iran. So there's a weakened moment. So in some ways that makes sense as much as his domestic political agenda might make sense. But it has just added to the sense of chaos in the Middle East and the real danger of this moment. Dave, you've been obviously keeping a very close eye on the ongoing carnage in Gaza. We did have Australia for the first time take another step of criticism, but that was all around the West Bank and focusing only on the two ministers there and the putting Medinsky-style sanctions on them.
I go back to my comment earlier about governing for the easily appeased and easily distracted. Israeli society is wholly Nazified at this point. 82% of the population are in favor of the genocide in Gaza. So sanctioning two ministers from a government that is committing Holocaust and atrocity is like very deliberately saying, Himmler, we're sanctioning you, but Göring, you're cool. Goebbels, we're sanctioning you, but Hitler, you're fine. It's a pathetic move in a time of Holocaust and atrocity. And the fact that people didn't even bring it up at the press clubs show you how captured the media is in this country. Israel has attacked many countries in that region offensively, not preemptively, like we heard on the ABC a bunch of times throughout this week. And it's incredulous that we are being asked to believe that our safety from terrorism, nuclear or otherwise, relies on Israel murdering civilians in a bunch of countries in the Middle East. It's absurd, and I don't think when people try that, we should almost laugh in their face. It's just disconnected from reality.
I mean, Royce, there were, I mean, Israel, clearly, there has been civilian deaths, including many children in Iran. But I have to say the strikes themselves have been targeted at basically military leadership and the scientific leadership around the nuclear program. And they do seem to have had some incredible success in really taking out a whole swathe. I think there's up to 9 leading nuclear scientists. Just this morning, it was reported that it was one of the leading advisors to Khomeini himself, who has been killed, along with the military chief of staff and the 2IC there.
So they can be specific when they want to hit someone specifically. They don't need to flatten an entire concentration camp. That's interesting. I didn't know they had the technology for that.
Yeah, no, well, they seem to have successfully done that in Tehran.
I think we need to be very clear as well. When you actually look at the impact sites of where those targeted strikes have, they are residential buildings. They are neighborhoods.
Yep.
People who were not involved in the military campaign or in the Iranian military were killed on those strikes.
Oh no, of course
So,
they were. Yep.
so we need and I think we also need to take a step back to the question of, and also another key point is one of the people who was struck in these strikes was an Iranian nuclear official who was involved in talks with the US, and only a week ago was saying that Iran was willing to do a deal with the US over a nuclear deal.
100%.
It's you need to take a step back and understand, well, why would Israel, which has been maximalist in its policy approach, which is to the extent that it demands everything, do this now? And there are two running theories. The first is that the US has tried to signal simultaneously that it had nothing to do with these strikes, but it was also given a heads up. Now, there are a number of different scenarios, but whether that is true or not, but it very much does seem like Trump wants to have his cake and eat it too in this story. And there's a question about, if you were engaged with negotiations with Iran on a nuclear deal, and you allowed this to go ahead from the Israelis, and there is even a suggestion that the Trump administration allowed Iranian authorities to believe that an attack was not imminent. How do you then build credibility in negotiations going forward? You don't. And whereas for Israel, I think it's been clear over the last 18 months that Israel's policy has been repeatedly attempting to draw the US into a broader conflict in the Middle East. That is where we are at in terms of this moment, is the extent to which US was involved, and the possibility that it may become drawn into a broader conflict again, which would be to the benefit of Israel and particularly Netanyahu, because Netanyahu's foreign policy has so far relied on the continued existence of an external threat to basically keep his government together and to continue to point towards something else as a way to kind of triangulate and to survive. And Netanyahu is, if nothing else, a survivor.
Indeed.
A bit of context I just want to add to this while people are getting scared about the things they're hearing on the radio. Israel has been talking about Iran's imminent nuclear threat since the early 90s. Like, this is something that comes up every couple of years when they need a distraction or when they want to launch some fucking missiles at Tehran.
Well, I think that's the sort of the interesting thing, is that there's talk about these negotiations between America and Iran, and to try and put the brakes on any sense that the nuclear program might take a military turn. Now, let's remember that it was Trump himself who withdrew America from the deal that Obama had negotiated in 2018, which seemed to be holding quite well. And let's also note that it was only in March this year, late March, that the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, still odd to say those words together, but gave evidence to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence that they did not believe that Iran was building a nuclear weapon, and that the Ayatollah had not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended, and that the intelligence community was continuing to monitor that. So, Marie, do you think that in a way we are right back into the Iraq weapons of mass destruction kind of narrative that enables a military, in this case Israel, in the case of Iraq, the US, to just do whatever the hell they wanted to do anyway, and using this as a narrative fig leaf?
The additional issue, though, is the position of the Gulf states.
Yep.
And the extent to which not only Mr. Trump but also his lovely family are engaged in financial transactions and so forth. Now, the Gulf states have come out with a very strong statement about the Israeli attack on Iran. Now, if Mr. Trump is too clever about supporting Israel in this matter, he's putting a lot of his own financial interest, let alone the public interest, at considerable risk in the general area. It is incredibly unstable.
Yeah. Yeah, and it does go to Royce's point that it is unclear exactly what Trump knew and when, and he does now seem to be trying to have it both ways. I mean, Marco Rubio came out immediately after the first round of strikes and said, this is unilateral action. We were not aware of it. Leave our military assets alone, because it it is clear that Iran is saying, well, if this
Yeah.
continues, we are quite justified in attacking US military assets as well as some of the European assets. And Royce, interestingly, Starmer and the UK very much seem to be activating some of their military assets and moving them into the region in support of Israel.
About 12 hours before the Israelis struck, there was a story circulating that the Iranians had managed to secure a great deal of confidential data about the Israelis' military capacity and their military plans, and that as the consequence of that, the Americans feared that something was going to happen and they had begun trying to pull their people out. So
Right.
I don't know. The drama about what has been happening with all of the missiles and so forth going backwards and forward meant that I haven't seen any further reference to that story about the Iranians having gained access into confidential Israeli data, which might also help to explain, if it's true, why the Israelis moved so quickly.
Yeah.
Yes, and that story was very significant. I mean, if I mean, we should be clear that has not yet been verified independently.
Mhm.
If true, though, the scale of that um, intelligence failure is stunning. It's exposed Israeli assets. It's details of their nuclear program. It's expansive. So it'd be very interesting to see if and how that story develops. I think to the other points about the involvement of the UK in this so far, I think this is very much just Starmer being more open about what the UK has been doing. There has already been reporting here and there about the UK running flights to Israel from its base in Cyprus, Akrotiri, and other support that the UK has offered. So in terms of the idea of Keir Starmer being intervening more openly in what is going on, and particularly to help defend, in their view, to help defend Israel against Iran in this moment, this is just a kind of further confirmation of an existing policy that already seems to be the case. The question, I think, for Starmer going forward is that how Starmer is facing election coming up next. The UK Labour Party has not been doing well, is facing challenges from reform, and has
Yeah.
largely been trying to outflank reform from the right, which I guess we'll see how that plays out and how effective that is.
Does that
And
ever work?
It never
No.
works.
I don't think that's ever worked.
No.
and Gaza will play a significant role in that election, where and Gaza and Iran now will play a significant role in that election when it happens.
Another thing I just want to mention it's grim as fuck, but the timing of this is they've cut the internet in Gaza a few days ago, right as they launched this attack on Iran. And if you really allow yourself to go to the dark place that's suggesting, think of the things you've already seen on the internet, and now they're cutting the internet as they enter this final stage of this genocide in Gaza. I think that's inseparable from why they've attacked Iran this week.
Mm. Well, look, there's a lot going on in the Middle East. The G7 will be happening in Canada. We will be interested to hear what comes out of, yes, Albanese's sidebar meeting with Trump, but also more broadly, the conversation that takes place at the G7 against this backdrop, which even a week ago we couldn't have anticipated would be the case. We're going to turn from the very global to the very local. Bit of a jarring segue, but
Let there be yes.
there has also been kind of machinations going on in the Tasmanian political front, in the sense that the Labor Party called on a no confidence motion in the Premier, Jeremy Rockliff. They've been threatening it for a while. They finally did it. Then no one really seemed to know what the hell was going to happen next, because nobody seemed to want the election, which was likely to be an inevitable outcome of that. So we spoke in the week to Dr. Kevin Bonham, who is one of the psephologists alongside sort of Ben Rowie and William Bowe, who have been providing such great analysis and support of our understanding around politics became almost internet celebrities, I would say, throughout the 25 campaign and certainly the count thereafter. He is going to lead us through what's happening in Tasmania, and then we will come back and have a few final observations about that. So let's hear from Kevin first. And so Tasmania is going back to the polls barely a year after its previous election. What is it about Tasmania that seems to be making it kind of the Italy of Australia?
Well, the last election was very inconclusive. We had quite low major party vote shares because we have the AUKUS system that's more or less proportional. At the last election, we ended up with nobody anywhere near a majority. Prior to that, we had a few majority Liberal governments in a row, but none of them were entirely stable. Two of them won majorities of one seat, which then collapsed during the Parliament.
And the Liberals had actually gone to the last election early, hoping to increase their majority, looking for more stability. And in fact, the reverse then happened for them.
They went to the last election because they'd lost their majority to two defectors, two MPs who defected largely over the Macquarie Point Stadium, but also citing other issues. They had a history of grievances with the party, and so the government was becoming unmanageable, and that was why they went to that election. But then they didn't get a much more workable parliament, although that was, to a large degree, their own fault for the way that they work with the crossbenchers.
So the last election was the first time that the Jackie Lambie network had run at a state level, and had some success.
Yeah, the Lambie network did run in
right.
in one previous election, but without getting anyone elected.
Okay.
This was the first time they got anyone elected. They got 3 MPs elected, two of whom lasted only 5 months before being thrown out of the party.
Yes.
And the final one remained a member of the Lambie network through the term, but it's now been announced that they're not actually going to run as a party for this election.
And that was Jackie Lambie's decision. I mean, her sole MP had not been aware of that until she made that public. Is that right?
She'd made some, with Lambie, sort of everything she says tends to be contradictory, but she'd made some comments last year saying, sort of, I'm not going to run anymore, but if Andrew Jenner runs again, I'll back him to the hilt, which, did sound like it would have been nice from his perspective if she'd just, sort of said, yeah, you can run as a JLN candidate, I'll endorse you, you do all the work. That would have been very helpful to him, because the Lambie name is a great one for getting sort of low information voters to just go and vote for you. So yeah, she has said that she's moved back from running candidates in state elections. She tried to run candidates in other states for the federal election without success.
Yeah, so she's just basically trying to consolidate her own position, because she had a bit of a scare at the federal election. So kind of retreating back to bolstering her own position rather than expanding as an organisation.
Yeah, she did get a bit of a scare at the federal election, but it was really not so much that her own vote went down to any major degree. It was more that the result between the major parties was unexpectedly lopsided, which made it possible in theory that Labor could have won 3 seats. In the end, based on preferences, Labor didn't get that close to doing so, but that was the scare. It wasn't One Nation and it wasn't her own vote crashing. It was the possibility of Labor winning 3.
So fast forward then to this year, after a relatively unstable year or so, Labor brought on a vote of no confidence in Rockcliffe and the current government that was successful. But everybody seems a bit surprised that the inevitable result of that means that Tasmania's going back to the polls. Even the governor was trying to find another solution.
Yes, this early in the term, the governor should try to appoint an alternative premier. If there is an alternative premier who's able to command the support of the House on supply and confidence, but there simply wasn't. There were a couple of ways out of it in theory. One is that Labor might have been willing to govern, but any government that Labor formed based on the numbers would have had to go through the Greens. Labor is very averse to working with the Greens and went to the last election saying they wouldn't do it. So they weren't willing to go down that path. And the other alternative was for the Liberals to pick a new leader who could renegotiate with the crossbench and carry on. That would have been extremely messy. It's not clear how long that would have lasted because there are just major differences between the crossbench and the government, particularly over things like the Macquarie Point Stadium, salmon farming is another issue. So it's not clear how long that would have gone on for, how legitimate it would have been seen, how much it would have ripped the Liberal Party apart to do it. And so there basically wasn't anyone who could command the support of the majority of the House.
It does seem that the Greens, that the Labor Party is really hostile towards the Greens in Tasmania. Now, Albanese is pretty hostile at a federal level, but at a state level, they simply refuse to govern with them, even when there is potentially a majority to be stitched up. Is that because of the unpopularity of previous coalition-style governments between Labor and the Greens? Or is it personal, ideological, or a mixture of all of the above?
Yes, there's been two previous cases where Labor governed with Green support of varying kinds. There was the Michael Field government, which initially had an accord agreement with the Greens in 1989, which that accord collapsed, and then the government itself didn't last very long. And then there was the 2010-2014 situation where Labor was left in office with a minority and ended up forming a coalition government with the Greens. Both those governments were thrashed at the polls, with the Liberals winning comfortable majorities. So there is a feeling that if Labor governs with the Greens, it's only going to be a one-term government before the same thing happens again.
Right. So now we've got a whole array of different candidates, not Jackie Lambie, but a lot of independents moving forward to fill that breach, some of which are the result of remnants of major party affiliations, like David O'Byrne, for example, but others are moving in because of the particular issues that are at play in Tasmania. So the stadium in particular has been big in the press, seems to excite a lot of emotions. Do you think it will play out electorally to benefit independents, given that both of the major parties seem to be supporting the AFL and the construction of the stadium at this point?
The stadium is a big issue in a lot of the state. It's unpopular almost everywhere. Parts of the electorate of Franklin, it polls okay, but most of the state, it's just like the north of the state hates it because it's in the south. The Hobart area hates it because it's in the Hobart area. So it's like, you know, there's both parochialism and a not here factor as well. And also voters in the Hobart area are much more likely to say, oh, we think the money should be spent on something else. Yeah. So there are a few different forces competing for the anti-stadium vote. So as well as independents, the Greens are against the stadium, and we now also have a National Party revival that's against the stadium too. That's sort of running as a sort of we will be stable and we will support, we will support stable government, but we support resource industries, we support fishing, fisheries and forestry, but we're against the stadium. So that's an interesting.
Oh yeah, does that have the potential to attract some vote, do you think?
I don't know how successful they're going to be, because some of the people, I mean, John Tucker, he was one of the Liberals who quit during the previous term, and he ran as an independent last election and didn't get much support. And he was running basically the same sort of line that the Nationals will be running. In fact, he's quite likely to pop up as a candidate for them. So that's So yeah, so there are a range of options for voters who are against the stadium and want to make that their biggest deal. The question is how much that vote scatters around between a bunch of independents who don't necessarily get much. We at the last election we had a lot of independents jumping in and running with the increased size of the House. That a lot of them thought they were a big chance, and
25
also
to 35. So
yes,
not
and
inconsiderable.
also the because of the teal success on the Australian mainland, a lot of them seem to be motivated by that. But that doesn't actually work here. It's unless you're very high profile, because here there's no reason not to vote for Labor or the Greens if you support one of those parties.
Yeah. I mean, we have seen a couple of both failed candidates and failed, MPs now popping up Erica Bett style to run in the Tasmanian Senate. So we've got Bridget Archer, who's declared her candidacy, and Peter George is now going to run at the state level. So there is a profile of those sorts of candidates. Will that help the Liberal Party, do you think, having someone of Bridget Archer's stature throwing a hat in the ring for them?
Yeah, profile is a big thing in Hare Clark elections. The way preferences work, sort of depending on preferences from other candidates from your own party, because each party runs multiple candidates in each seat, and you're also depending on the ability to pick up votes that cross parties. Some voters vote all over the place. In fact, quite a few voters will vote all over the place and don't follow party lines, and so sort of having high name recognition is very important for catching those votes and for doing well in the preference distributions. So the Liberals do seem to be off to a good start in terms of finding known names to run for them. A lot of recycled past candidates, and because of the short time frame for the election, parties are not going to have a lot of time for proper vetting and may sort of err on the side of running candidates that they've run before, even if those candidates were quite controversial, just to avoid disasters.
Peter George ran federally, and it seems to be gearing up to run at a state level pretty much on the issue of salmon. That seemed to cut both ways in the federal election, in that Jackie Lambie, who'd been so vocal, saw some of her support drop, although the point you make is it was less than perhaps the headlines were suggesting. Whereas Peter George actually did very well in Franklin there. Do you think that continues to play a big issue in local politics in Tasmania?
I think it's a big issue in Franklin. In Braddon, which includes the Macquarie Harbour area, where there's been the contention about the Morgan's Gate and impacts of salmon farming on that endangered species, there were some people got behind the industry, and Lambie's vote crashed in some of these small booths on the west coast. But in Franklin, there are a lot of coastal communities that are fairly greenish leaning anyway, and that got behind Peter George.
The other big local issue was the debacle around the delivery of the ferries for the Spirit of Tasmania, and that when they were finally going to be ready, the port wasn't big enough for them. That does seem to be a high level of incompetence for a government of any description. Does that continue to attract attention and criticism?
Yes, that was something where Dean Winter sort of started jumping on in question time at the start of the term, and sort of everybody was going, sort of, why are you asking so many questions about these ferries? And it soon turned out that he was actually onto something very big, and they must have done something. That has been sort of like a sort of a case in point for this government has been in for too long and can no longer do stuff. Although the government has had success in other major projects, it's like that one is just such an incredible stuff up. It's from sort of the realms of political satire TV shows. You can't make it up kind of stuff.
Tasmania often, it's the poorest state. The education levels are challenging, literacy levels below the national average. Is there a sense that there's a sort of an it's time factor that the government hasn't been able to deliver for its population? There's been some scandals around whistleblowing, that people may be looking for an alternative now.
The past record is that Tasmanians don't like minority governments.
Yeah.
The last 4 minority governments that were elected as minority governments all got punished very harshly at the next election. They all lost. Some of them lost very heavily. So the pattern in the past has been that Tasmanians will flock to the opposition in cases like this, and often give the opposition a majority, or in this case, a majority is hard to get. Labor needs a massive swing for a majority, something like 13%. But something near that, you may get a decisive break in Labor's favour just off this government having been such a mess and having been a minority government. The other alternative is that you actually don't get that, and you don't get much voter movement, and you get a continuation of what we've had in this parliament. And if we go down that track again, things could be unstable going into the future.
So there we go. That's Kevin Bonham's take on Tasmania. Look, we have almost run out of time, but Royce, what the hell is it with the AFL here? The cost of the stadium has blown out by nearly $200 million before they've turned the first sod. Why is the AFL being so dictatorial in this way?
I don't actually know the answer to that, but I think there's actually a very good investigative story to be written about the way the AFL does business. I'm aware of several cases around the country where new the facilities have been built on penny leases, for $1 to build a new training facility, or across the board. Very sketchy deals done, and I think that's an open question that needs to be more thoroughly interrogated.
Incredible deals for an incredibly wealthy organisation, just going in and dictating terms when Tasmania is already in, financially difficult times, impecunious, one might describe it as, and yet they're preparing to spend nearly $1 billion on a stadium that would be used only a handful of times a year. We're going to have a lot to talk about next week when we see how the G7 plays out, when we know a bit more about the way that Trump is going to handle what's going on in Los Angeles, and whether or not the economics of disappearing workers from a whole range of industries is going to play out badly for his donors, and he is going to make some more moves on that point. But for now, I'm going to ask our panelists if there's any top tips that they would like to reference for the upcoming week, something you've got your eye on, something you'd like to recommend, something you're outraged by before we head off. Marie, any comment from you?
There's too much to go through, but
we could do another
I
hour.
Just
you really would.
Listening to Kevin Bonham, and I was reminded that I was at the press club during the Gillard government when we had the famous statement by the group of independents who were discussing whether or not they were going to support the Gillard government. And I happened to be sitting next to the Danish ambassador. And he said, "This is new to you people, but we have 26 parties in our government."
Yeah.
And I thought, yes, it may be that we're going to have to get used to
to more
some interesting changes. And Tasmania is a microcosm of that at the moment. The people keep on getting it wrong. They just won't give anybody a majority.
And it is astonishing, really. Like at the last Tasmanian election, if Labor had wanted to, there was a minority government there for them to form, and they refused to negotiate with the Greens and the Independents at all. They just handed government over to the Liberals. So, yeah, it's very surprising. Royce, any top tip from you?
Look, no top tip yet, but I do want to do a kind of cheeky self-promotion.
Oh no, please. Is that
Some people may have caught the report I did into the relationship between Monash University and Woodside in the Guardian this week. I have a longer, more expansive investigative feature coming through the US climate reporting outfit Drilled. Hopefully this week, maybe the Monday after, but it goes to much more detail about that relationship and the efforts to unpick it.
great? We shall look out for that. Dave, any final words from you?
Yes, I suppose nothing too cheery.
We would expect nothing less.
I apologize for the way I am. I can't change it. We're living during a time of atrocity and Holocaust, and in these moments, not saying anything enables it. And our Prime Minister and our government is wholly complicit. And we have a situation where a genocidal, apartheid, ethno state is murdering civilians across the world. And if you talk about it, you get fired, you get kicked out of polite society. Don't stand for that. Just don't. Absolutely do not roll over in advance. Fuck that.
Silence is indeed complicity. Thank you all very much for watching us this morning on the Sunday Shot. As ever, we really would appreciate you subscribing to our YouTube channel. You could even throw us a few dollars so that we can ensure that we can keep going for at least the next few months. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Bye.